Practices Manager with the Lifeline. Here in Chile, the STP division is the second webinar of the year, as I mentioned, titled Lifeline Results, the Value of Lived Experience, featuring Dr. Levine, who was the survey and report writer. Full introduction. His full shared in the Lifeline Weekly and that was sent yesterday. A few webinar reminders for all. Recommend that is in the chat. Particularly if you do have computer speakers, so use those to hear. As you may have discovered, please keep the volume of your computer speakers muted. Also, we ask that you mute for those who are on this conference line to minimize. And as I always remind everyone, please find at any time. Levine is our primary speaker today, but we will first Shari Sinwelski, Director of the who will provide some content for the delivery of this webinar, as well as review our objectives. Dr. John Draper, Lifeline's Project Director, will say a few words. After the presentation, the questions are chat into your chat box at any time. And again, this webinar, we will make it available to the Lifeline Network. So at this time, I am our poll. Our objectives and allow Shari Sinwelski. Why we put this, Shari.
I'm very excited to be hosting this. That the Lifeline has always tried to have been personally affected. So Lifeline Consumer Survivor Subcommittee that's of people with lived experience, either as a suicide attempt survivor or as a loss survivor. And we've really been focused on trying to make sure that the work that we do with the Lifeline and with the Crisis Center reflects the needs of people who actually will be using the services that we provide. Interestingly, last year, you know, we offered our evaluation webinar series, and one of the components of that series was to integrate, again, the voice of lived experience. And we received just such great feedback from the network on that component. Centers really loved to be able to hear what people who have had the experience of having a suicide attempt or being suicidal, how they felt about the research and the standards and practices that we incorporate into the Lifeline. And so I think it just kind of sets the stage that lets us know that centers are really looking for ways to incorporate attempt survivors into their work more and more. So the objectives of this workshop today are to just set the stage a little bit for the bigger context of where this is coming from and why we're doing this. You know, many years ago, the Lifeline produced a document, I think it was in 2007, that was really talking about working with attempt survivors and how we may work better with attempt survivors in the field of suicide prevention. And since then, the Lifeline, John and myself have been working, you know, on the national level to continue to work in this field as part of the Suicide Attempt Survivor Task Force of the National Action Alliance. We've helped with DeQuincy's help, with Dr. Lezine's help, to write the Way Forward document, which Quicks is going to go over for us as part of this webinar today. So really just kind of understanding what are the values that suicide attempt survivors think are important as they are working with different organizations in the field of suicide prevention. And then most importantly, we're going to talk about a survey. We know that the crisis centers are looking for ways to work more closely with suicide attempt survivors, but maybe are a little bit at a loss as to how to start that process. You know, a lot of questions come up when people start to think, okay, how can I work with suicide attempt survivors, and how can I have their voice be heard in my crisis center? And so we actually, as you probably know, hopefully you participated, we released a survey asking centers what they needed, and Dr. Lezine worked very hard to compile those results for us, and he's going to talk about those today. And then kind of what are our next steps now that we know that what centers are looking for in terms of working with attempt survivors. How might we help support them as they're integrating the voice of lived experience into their crisis centers? So what are some of the plans for how we might do that? So I think that's all I've got, Karen, and I think John might want to step in next.
Thank you so much, Shari, for that introduction. Yeah, so John, let's introduce DeQuincy.
Happy to do that, Karen. Thank you, and thank you, Shari, as well. I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure to meet Dr. DeQuincy Lezine, but he has been a very close friend to our field and the Lifeline for many years. And for our field, DeQuincy, or who those of us who are close to him like to refer to him as Quicks, he has long been a voice for suicide attempt survivors, really beginning back in the Reno Suicide Prevention Conference, which set the stage for a lot of suicide prevention activities back in 1999. He was the voice of attempt survivors then. And he was also most recently appointed the first chair of the American Association of Suicidology's Suicide Attempt Survivor Division. He's also a very key member of our task force for suicide attempt survivors of the Action Alliance. And now, Quicks is the director of the Center for Dignity, Recovery, and Empowerment at the Mental Health Association of San Francisco, of which Eduardo Vega, another long friend and steering committee member, is the executive director. Quicks is also a very well-respected researcher, authoring books and journal publications, including being the primary author for what is now a groundbreaking document, the Suicide Attempt Survivors Task Force, the Way Forward document. But for the Lifeline, really, Quicks has been a major contributor and advisor for us for the past 9 years. He has been a consumer survivor subcommittee member since 2006. He is a steering committee member. He is now the co-chair of the Consumer Survivor Subcommittee, along with my wife calls her Sally Jesse Raphael, Sally Spencer Thomas. Also, he is the spokesperson on the Lifeline panel for attempt survivors at the 2007 Crisis Centers Conference, so some of you may remember him from back then. He helped author the Lifeline's first follow-up guidances document, so he's helped us a lot on the practice end in terms of helping us determine the best approaches for follow-up from the consumer and researcher's viewpoint. Also, he participated in reviewing the Lifeline simulation program for centers. For those of you who are using the simulation program, know that the fingerprints of Dr. Lezine are all over that. He also participated in reviewing the Lifeline's quality improvement form in the quality improvement forum work group, And he's participated in videos for us to promote the Lifeline for many years. He's now the facilitator, most recently, facilitator of a work group that created the Crisis Center survey that you're about to hear the results of. And this is a very, very exciting survey. I really want to acknowledge not only Dr. Lezine's work in putting together this survey, but the entire work group, and most importantly, all of you who took the time to respond to the survey. We had a terrific response rate among our centers, and the results were eye-opening and really very helpful. So we hope that you'll find the results as interesting and helpful too. And I'll turn it over to Dr. DeQuincy Lezine, who again, it's my privilege and honor to call him both a great advisor for us as well as a good friend. Quicks?
All right, thank you, John, and Karen and Sherry for setting this up. It's great to have everybody on it. I'm glad that people have been able to join this webinar to hear more about the survey and a little bit about what sets the survey up. As John mentioned, I'm a suicide attempt survivor and also a researcher and have been in the field both in the practice area and in the research area for quite some time. My personal story is in the book 8 Stories Up, for those who are familiar with that or would like to take a look at that. But right now I'm going to focus more on what we've done as a task force first, and then moving from there, what we did for the Lifeline survey. I could go to the next, there we go. So the Suicide Attempt Survivors Task Force, what this was is part of the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, created several task forces to focus on high priority goals. And so some of our leadership came from the XCOM Executive Committee, including Eduardo Vega, who John just mentioned, and John Draper being our co-chairs for that. We were 17 members from across the U.S., and mostly our goal was to take the National Strategy for Suicide Prevention and add to it or create something that would be more practically focused on how do you put some of these things into place from an attempt survivor or lived experience perspective. Okay, next slide. So the overview of this is that the main idea is that the people who have the most intimate information about suicide are the people who've been closest to it. So those would be the people who either have their own personal experience or people who have been close to somebody who died by suicide or somebody who's attempted suicide. The folks who have been in there kind of on a day-to-day basis with this seem to have the most intimate experience about what that would be like. So this document tries to look at the evidence base that we use in suicide prevention and look at it in terms of how somebody with lived experience would view this being put into place in practice. So the overarching goal is to try to create better supports for people, and the hope, obviously, is to save lives and then also prevent future suicide attempts. Okay, next slide. The core values were created by the task force looking at some of the values that are used in the recovery movement, as well as values that came specifically from suicide attempt survivors. The primary one, I'd say, is to inspire hope and meaning and purpose. It's kind of a driving value for suicide attempt survivors and other people with lived experience, where the idea is that without hope and meaning, people don't really want to survive. And so that would be a really key area to focus on. The others include preserving dignity, which is kind of the opposite of stigma or negative stereotypes, and that kind of discrimination that occurs to people. Connecting folks to peer support, acknowledging that some of the people who have that experience can be some of the best helpers. And this is something that is going to play in again when we talk about the survey. Promoting community connectedness is keeping people connected both to their own social supports and family and friends, as well as connecting things within the neighborhoods or within communities, such as having, for instance, crisis centers more formally connected with hospitals or emergency departments. How do you pull together mobile crisis teams? So having things be formally connected so that people don't fall through the cracks in the community. Along with community connectedness is the idea of engaging and supporting the family and friends of attempt survivors. so that we want to have them be able to be supported in helping the person who is going through a suicidal experience, and also acknowledging that it can be an incredibly trying and exhausting or challenging experience to try to help somebody get through a suicidal crisis. So those folks need support for themselves as well. We want to respect and support cultural and spiritual beliefs and the traditions. How do you bring those types of traditions in as an asset when creating treatment or supports for people? And then the ideas of choice and collaboration, which have come up again in the Clinical Care Task Force, which is filtered into the Zero Suicide effort, where some of the main components of taking care of people in a crisis should involve choice and collaboration. And then from there as well, timely access to care and support being something that needs to happen so that people, again, don't fall through the cracks right after receiving another type of care support. And for those of you who are involved in the follow-up components of the Lifeline efforts, you know how important it is to try to have timely follow-up with people and timely access for them to have additional support from the community. Next slide. So really, the Way Forward document tries to encompass multiple suicide prevention approaches, going from kind of the middle, which would be self-help and peer support, up to including family and friends, the mental health system, crisis and emergency services, connecting those services together in continuity of care, and then the last circle would be community outreach. So how do you reach beyond the main clinical systems into the broader community? Next slide. So I just wanted to pull one example area, so 3 recommendations that are included in the document, just as kind of an example of what types of recommendations are included. One of them was a practice for crisis center and hotline staff to review the Lifeline service and outreach strategies that were suggested by suicide attempt survivors. I believe John and Sherry both referenced an effort that was made by the Lifeline quite some time ago in trying to pull together attempt survivors from the national arena and talk about what types of strategies should the Lifeline or the field really use to move forward to help support attempt survivors. And a lot of this work has then been incorporated into the Consumer Survivor Subcommittee, but some of those are pretty core in terms of viewpoints that might be used in crisis center work. For a program would be developing and promoting crisis respite care centers, especially those that employ peer providers, would be kind of an alternative to the traditional type of hospital and clinical care settings. Many are places that somebody can go before they in an imminent crisis and are often less expensive and more community-based alternatives. As for a policy, would be promoting the use of mobile crisis teams, particularly those who include a peer specialist, because they can use their lived experience as an asset during interventions. Again, that's something that will come up as well in the survey. But one of the ideas here is that people would be able to be supported within their community and not have to necessarily have kind of police involvement or other people involved who don't have that specialty training. So for those of you who run mobile crisis teams, thank you very much for having those, and we find that those are incredibly valuable. Next slide. All right, so getting from there, kind of the setup for this suicide attempt survivor survey for Lifeline centers to see what kinds of supports are currently out there, what types of things do we need to develop further, and what we need to do or could possibly do to support centers in engaging further with people who have lived experience. So the survey rolled out in May of last year, lasted approximately a month. We had notice that went out through webinars as well as emails, and we had about 103 surveys come back of 91 centers. So a big thank you to everybody who completed the survey. It was very helpful. It was developed based on a prior Lifeline survey, primarily one that was went out about supports for suicide loss survivors. And then we had work group discussions and pilot testing to develop the survey before it actually rolled out to centers. So one of the issues that has come up since then is about whether we talk more about suicide attempt survivors specifically, or if we talk more broadly about lived experience. And you'll notice that for the American Association of Suicidology division, it's called the Division for Attempt Survivors and Lived Experience, to try to pull both of those into place. One of the issues, though, in terms of doing surveying was that attempt survivor has more recognition, and the definition can be more objective, in that somebody who calls in can either self-identify as an attempt survivor or might volunteer after answering a yes to question like, have you ever attempted suicide, so that it should be something that is much easier to record and gather than perhaps whether or not somebody has previously had experience with a suicidal crisis, which might not come up in a conversation or might not be recorded in data particularly. So one of the questions was if there are open suicide attempt survivors at centers. And we found that a little over half said that there were definitely open attempt survivors. About a quarter said that they weren't really sure. Of those who said that they did have open suicide attempt survivors, people who were staff or volunteers who had disclosed their prior suicidal experience, those who had attempt survivors and leaders included about 17% of the survey respondents. So we do have some centers already out there who have open attempt survivors serving in volunteer or staff capacities, and some also in leadership capacity. So we know that folks have already kind of set the stage for this, and we want to pull in what their experiences are in terms of trying to support other people going forward. And we asked some about the center resources that are out for attempt survivor issues and tried to gather information about a wide range of issues, as you can see here. We tried to ask both if callers had requested certain resources and whether or not those were currently being offered. I highlighted just a few here, choosing peer services and suicide attempt survivor groups, as well as spiritual existential issues at the bottom, as being areas where there are more people requesting it than we have offers available to folks. So 3 areas where having additional resources would be helpful to the people who are calling in for our services. We had many more resources currently available for how to tell others about a suicidal experience, helping oneself, and getting involved with crisis services. So those are great resources that are not necessarily well known. As we see, still it's around 60% or so, but it is fulfilling the need that's currently there. So great. Go to the next slide. So one of the things there was attempt survivor support groups. This would be support groups specifically for suicide attempt survivors. One was actually held at the center, which was great. And then one had sometimes available through the hospital, a group that people had to pay for. So primarily a clinical group that was being run through the hospital. And we hope that even that one was not always available, kind of sporadic in whether or not it would be offered. Others talked about either a loss survivor group or general mental health groups, so those being much more prevalent than having groups that are specifically for people who have been suicidal. It's one of the things that the field has been trying to grow and encourage over the last few years. And we have several being developed, but not as much solid information or solid distribution of those. We asked as well about information for family and friends. These were, see if I can go back there. These were both 2 follow-up questions. If centers said that they were currently offering this information, we asked for a little bit more on what types of information they were asking or providing. And for this one, there's information about suicide, but not specifically necessarily about how family and friends could participate or be taken care of. There were loss survivor groups, and there could be some groups that address some of the concerns, but mostly, again, it focuses on how do you help the attempt survivor, not really support for those family and friends. And then in reviewing information for the Way Forward document, it was pretty similar. that there was some information for family and friends, and what was out there was primarily about how people can support the attempt survivor, which is extremely important work, but not much out there in terms of how do you support the supporters. It's something that we need to develop further. Next slide. We talked some about how centers try to recruit attempt survivors. How do you get them into staff and volunteer positions? How do you engage with them? Many said that they didn't have any specific recruiting, but that some people who have already worked there have since disclosed that they had their own personal experiences. A few places asked about lived experience during the interview. Some ways that they did that was just to say that such experience was welcome and encouraged or valued. And then others kind of asked about it as something that would be potentially negative, if it's something that could affect somebody's capability for work, or kind of a risk assessment for whether or not somebody would be able to work in. A few places specifically hire peer specialists or for follow-up services where recruitment for somebody experience to be able to those positions and utilize their for those types of services. A few organizations also partnered with peer support directly from them, in which the more general questions that might be asked in terms of recruiting staff and volunteers, but among a pool of people who they know probably have their own experience. The next slide. Some of the examples of what we heard in the process of the survey. One said that they, within the interview, asked the open-ended question, just tell me about your experience with suicide. And then being open to hiring people as long as they weren't currently actively suicidal, and had a just kind of open to folks experience or solely people who fight suicide or people who have their own person. And again, people can choose to things, so they could bring in experience or past clinical experience is related to the services that they can choose to not disclose at all. Encourage the story for where they're from. Again, this is kind of a topic that opens process about attempts, how it could have views and how impacted them on the hotline. Get the next slide. So we did have open suicide attempt survivors as staff or what types of supports were available, and were types of supports. One available, and the other for specific experience. So for one staff, it could be debriefing at times with even a designated if the crisis physical space to allow that. So allow for a break, which is able to be done in places that had kind of a larger pool of people so that you could afford the time period, have breaks and have that be time. Often, ability of a supervisor who they could talk to, or EAP service who could go to, particularly distressing or stressful experience on the lines. And then training about self-care, taking care of oneself. These are all types of things that we promoted for all staff, regardless of had personal experience or not, it would be particularly beneficial for the people who had lived experience. Others support specifically for people who said that they had their own personal experience, including developing a plan, so something that would be similar to kind of a mental health wellness plan in the community, but very specific to the workplace. How do you take care of your after difficult calls, or when you're not feeling well yourself, or if there's things happening in your community or in your life, how do you handle that within the work sphere? And others do regular checks and then monitoring or screening or assessing or supervising more closely if somebody's having a hard time. Next slide. Okay, so supporting staff, some of the examples that people gave was to train debrief contact with senior crisis specialists, and there's private space for that. So anybody has a particularly difficult contact, debrief with them, with somebody who's more senior, say how do we work through this or that. Had department for primary debriefing, a specific debrief will connect after, which is particularly useful for people to just kind of have a group of people to what they kind of get some camaraderie and peer support around working in crisis services, which can be extremely stressful. People through recognition and coaching and additional education experiences, and then having support available for anybody who's sometimes this would be on site, and then sometimes this would be just having an on-call senior staff person. We asked some about the mutual support after that. Providing training to people about disclosure and how do you use your lived experience. So developing lived expertise. And this goes the idea of how do you know when somebody's ready, because it provides a way to move into readiness to be able to help others. How do you pull in your personal experience and have that be something that you can use instead of have that just be something that other experiences or in addition to your other professional those two. And then going from there, we have a training to be a speaker about the experience. So whether or not you're disclosing in a circle or if you're disclosing in a more public sphere, we want to have training and development to do that. So those are also in development and testing at the center. Similarly, we have suicide prevention peer specialist training. That's in development and research testing. And this is really one of the areas that we're focusing on is in the post-discharge period. So leaving either inpatient psychiatric hospitalization department or leaving other community services. How do you bridge the gap in those types of places and making it to and engaging with services that are available to somebody. We don't want to have people leave the hospital and not have anything, or to have them leave the hospital with just a referral that they might not follow up on, especially given that that's such a dangerous period for people in terms of dying by suicide, in terms of doing repeat attempts is just within the following discharge from the hospital, where they just don't make it to the types of services, even if those services would have been beneficial for them. That with people who have been there. And then on the other side, we're doing more research-based efforts on stigma, how that relates to suicidal experience, including both within and with some international partners in Europe and Australia. We have a broad range of issues that we're tackling. Basically, how do you take the suicide and make it into something that can be useful in suicide prevention? One of the things that we're now, I'm specifically developing right now, developing crisis center technical assistance. So on one side, we have how does an individual become ready in crisis center work or in crisis work as a primary provider and a peer specialist. And on the other side, we have how to engage with persons with lived experience. And that's the aspects of it. How do you go out and find, as well as how do you support them when they are engaged in trying to pull in some of the efforts and developed in the survey process, where we had survey respondents tell us we want to kind of try to promote those. The challenges were and figure out ways that we can address so that it is easier for centers to engage with persons who have lived experience. we're exploring the survey topics in depth, trying to figure out potential best practice solutions. One of the things that's very important is relationships. And we don't want to be the ones to kind of take what's already been said and develop something within our shop and then send it out and say that it is to be engaged with people doing the crisis center work day to day from the start to say how do we facing, how do we practice overcome these, and how do we engage with suicide attempts. 3 Lifeline centers in California, the area, and 1 down in Tennessee. We're going to do focus groups at each crisis center. These would be at least 4 to 6 people that different volunteers and staff, and hopefully leaders as well. Figure out after had before specific ideas that what the benefits and find out more in. We had some. We want to find those perspectives. So for us, we're following up from that. We're creating an advisory group. So this would just be 1 or 2 people identified from each more specific on the process, creating recommendations between RE recovery and empowerment and the crisis, and seeing where points of agreement and points where we all think that it would be great moving forward. We'll have a finalized funding agency here, Cal Mesa, and then move forward with some evaluation of these types of practice efforts or recommendations, and then try to disseminate that information into Lifeline centers. So that's what we have going on at the center. Some folks in other areas helping suicide groups using a number of models, including from was recently registry that have been ongoing, including one in Illinois and one up in
the use of self and self-disclosure is a lot of centers always seeking. How that type of anyone understanding of what the person or through the chat or text. So again, I believe that they might have ways collecting information and passing it on to those seeking different services and a lot of that serves and on the different support calls that we facilitate, and we would just our fellow centers, and then we of course put some of that on the Network Resource Center. The way forward, if you had not been able to view that full document yet, it can be accessed center. That's an easy way for you to locate. As well as the recording of this webinar, which will be on the webinar page of the Network Resource. So just in order to view the slides, and then you'll be notified has been posted. Thank you for filling out this poll question. I don't I'm going to mention the next webinar that the Lifeline will be delivering in March 19th, time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We're very excited to be delivering our first interactive webinar, which simply means there'll be less formal presentation, but more of a conversation. It will be through the same medium here that we use, but this will be our quarterly Ask the Expert webinar featuring Dr. David Jobes. So we're excited to try this out this year versus what we had done in 2014 quarterly, which was delivering the evaluation webinars that Sherry had mentioned earlier. So do stay tuned for that. We are very happy that DeQuincy was available to be such a key part and leader in the survey and the valuable information that it's yielded. Please let us know of any questions that we can help you with in the future. I'm sure that DeQuincy will be happy to answer any questions that might occur to you later. Anything else that you'd like to add, Sherry or John?
Other than thank you and nice job, everyone, nothing.
Okay, well, thanks for being here with us, John, and for that introduction to DeQuincy's portion. DeQuincy, anything else you'd like to say?
That's it for me. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Sherry.
I don't think so. Just a thank you to everybody for joining. I think I would throw out there as well for the way forward that if you go to the website version, Active Action Alliance, there is also some videos and abbreviated versions of the recommendations from the way forward that you can find there.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for mentioning that. Okay, I do see that someone's typing, so I'm just going to hang in there and and see what they might want to share. Thank you to everyone who's been available to participate today. It seems right now that the impact of the survey results on crisis center work has so far seemed to be the most helpful and useful about today's webinar. In second place, we've got the background of the survey and the results. So thank you for completing that and giving us that insight. You're welcome, those of you who are saying thank you. I believe we are good to go. If there aren't other comments or questions, thank you all for your time. You can disconnect when it's convenient for you to do so, and stay tuned for future announcements on upcoming webinars that the Lifeline will be delivering. Thank you again to our featured speaker, Dr. Lazine. We appreciate working with you.
The conference is now finished. You will now be disconnected.